George Berkeley constructed one of philosophy's most radical propositions in 1710. His central claim challenges what nearly everyone considers obvious about reality. He argued that material substance does not exist at all. Physical objects are merely collections of sensations or ideas in minds. The table before you is not made of independent matter. It exists only as experiences of solidity, colour and shape in consciousness. Berkeley was not denying that tables and mountains are real. He insisted his philosophy defended common sense better than materialist alternatives did. The physical world exists but depends entirely on perception for its being. Nothing can exist outside of minds except other minds themselves. This doctrine emerged from his systematic critique of his predecessors, John Locke. Berkeley identified fundamental contradictions in how philosophers understood sensory experience and knowledge. His solution eliminated matter entirely while preserving the experience world we inhabit. The consequences rippled through epistemology, metaphysics, theology, and eventually quantum physics itself. Understanding Berkeley requires grasping how he reasoned from perception to ontology. His arguments built methodically from what we actually experience to radical conclusions. Each step appeared reasonable, while the destination seemed absurd to most readers. Yet Berkeley maintained his system avoided skepticism better than materialism ever could. We will examine his core arguments without presuming their conclusion is wrong. His reasoning deserves engagement on its own terms before evaluation begins. Berkeley forces us to question what we assume about existence itself. The journey reveals how thin the ground beneath our certainties actually is. Part 1. The Foundation, Esse, Est, Percipi. Berkeley's philosophy rests on one principle stated in Latin, Esse, Est, Percipi. Translated precisely, it means to be is to be perceived. He later refined this to esse est percipi aut, percipere. To be is to be perceived or to perceive. This captures Berkeley's complete ontology with two categories of existing things only: ideas or sensations that are perceived, and minds or spirits that perceive them. The principle sounds simple, but contains profound implications for what exists. Berkeley developed this doctrine through careful analysis of human knowledge and experience. He began from empiricist premises that knowledge derives entirely from sensory experience. Unlike John Locke, who accepted material substances behind our perceptions, Berkeley eliminated them. His reasoning proceeded systematically from what we directly apprehend through our senses. When you perceive an apple, what exactly do you experience directly in consciousness? You experience a particular red colour, a certain round shape, smooth texture. You taste sweetness, smell a distinctive fragrance, feel coolness and firmness. These sensations or ideas constitute your entire direct acquaintance with the apple. You never perceive matter itself, only the collection of sensory qualities. Berkeley pushed this observation to its logical conclusion with relentless consistency. If all we ever encounter are ideas or sensations, what justifies positing matter? Matter supposedly exists as an independent substance underlying and causing our perceptions. But we have no direct experience of this alleged material substrate whatsoever. Every property we attribute to objects comes from our sensory experiences alone. The supposed material substratum remains completely unknown and unknowable to finite minds. Berkeley argued that objects simply are collections of ideas that appear together regularly. An apple is nothing more than a particular clustering of sensory experiences. The red colour, sweet taste, round shape, and apple smell constitute the apple. Remove all these perceptible qualities and nothing remains to be called an object. This analysis applies universally to everything we call a physical or material thing. Mountains, rivers, stars, atoms, brains, all reduce to collections of sensory ideas. The entire physical world exists as patterns of perception rather than independent matter. Berkeley insisted this position respects what we actually experience more faithfully than materialism. He distinguished carefully between ideas and the minds that perceive those ideas. Ideas are passive, inert, and dependent entirely on being perceived for their existence. Minds or spirits are active, capable of perceiving ideas and causing volitions. Unlike ideas, minds cannot be directly perceived as objects of sensory experience. We know our own minds through immediate inner awareness or reflection. We infer other finite minds exist because their actions exhibit intelligent, purposeful behavior. The Esse, Est, Percipi principle applies only to sensible things and ideas. Minds themselves are not ideas, so they exist through their activity of perceiving. This creates Berkeley's dualism between passive ideas and active perceiving spirits. But unlike Cartesian dualism with mind and matter, Berkeley has minds and ideas only. His system eliminated the troublesome interaction problem that plagued Cartesian substance dualism. Descartes could never explain how immaterial mind causally interacts with material body satisfactorily. Berkeley's framework avoids this entirely, since ideas depend on minds by their nature. Minds cause ideas through divine action or perceive ideas caused by God. Berkeley grounded this metaphysics in careful analysis of what perception actually delivers. He examined ordinary cases of sensory experience with philosophical precision and rigour. When I see a tree, I directly apprehend green colour and brown bark. I perceive particular shapes and spatial arrangements of visual qualities in consciousness. The tree as experience consists entirely of these perceived qualities and nothing more. Any supposed material substance supporting these qualities remains completely inaccessible to perception itself. This analysis extends to all sensory modalities and all supposedly physical objects. Touch delivers sensations of hardness, smoothness, warmth, and resistance to pressure. Hearing provides auditory qualities like pitch, timbre, loudness, and spatial location of sounds. Smell presents various odour qualities, while taste offers sweet, bitter, sour flavours. In every case, direct experience provides only the sensible qualities themselves. The material substratum supposedly underlying these qualities never appears in actual perception. Berkeley concluded that positing matter involves adding an unwarranted theoretical entity. Empiricism demands we restrict ontology to what experience actually reveals to conscious awareness. His principle faced immediate objections that Berkeley anticipated and addressed systematically. Critics asked what happens to objects when no human mind perceives them. Does the tree cease existing when everyone stops looking at it completely? Berkeley's answer involved God's perception sustaining objects during gaps in human awareness. We will examine this theological solution and its problems in detail later. For now, understand the principle. Physical objects exist only as perceived or perceivable. Another objection concerned the distinction between real objects and mere imaginary ideas. Both exist as ideas in mind, according to Berkeley's system, apparently. What distinguishes actually perceiving a tree from merely imagining or hallucinating one? Berkeley responded that ideas of sense differ from imagination through their involuntariness. I cannot control the sensory ideas that arise during perception at will. They exhibit order, coherence, and regularity that imagination lacks entirely in comparison. Real objects also produce sensory ideas in multiple modalities that cohere together. I see the tree, touch its bark, smell its sap simultaneously in experience. These diverse sensations fit together in law-like patterns that mark them as real. Imaginary ideas lack this systematic coordination across different senses and different observers. Berkeley emphasized that his immaterialism preserved everything valuable about common-sense belief. Ordinary people do not believe in material substance as philosophers define it. They believe tables and chairs exist and possess the properties we experience them having. Berkeley's philosophy vindicates these beliefs perfectly, while rejecting philosophical materialism's abstract theoretical posits. The table exists as a stable collection of ideas that multiple observers experience. It possesses the shape, color, and solidity that we perceive it having in experience. Berkeley denied none of this ordinary knowledge about the experienced physical world. He rejected only the additional claim that an unknowable material substance underlies experience. His principle thus aimed to clarify rather than overturn our understanding of reality. Philosophers had obscured matters by introducing unnecessary theoretical entities like material substance. Berkeley stripped away these philosophical confusions to reveal what actually exists clearly. Only minds and their ideas exist, related through perception and divine causation. This foundation supported his entire philosophical system's architecture and subsequent arguments. Everything else followed from properly understanding what Esse est Percipi actually entails. Berkeley developed his metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of science from this starting point. The principle remained constant while its implications ramified through every philosophical domain systematically. Understanding this foundation requires suspending immediate rejection and following the reasoning carefully. Berkeley was not confused or deliberately paradoxical in his philosophical methodology. He built his case through rigorous analysis of perception, existence, and knowledge claims. The arguments deserve engagement before evaluation of their ultimate success or failure begins. Part 2. The rejection of abstract ideas. Berkeley's attack on abstract ideas formed a crucial pillar supporting his entire immaterialist system. He devoted the introduction to his Principles of Human Knowledge to demolishing this doctrine. John Locke had argued that minds possess the power to form general abstract ideas. These abstractions supposedly allow us to think about triangles in general, not just particular triangles. According to Locke, the mind observes many particular triangles and abstracts their common features. It separates what all triangles share from what makes each triangle unique and particular. The resulting abstract idea of triangle would be neither equilateral nor scalene, nor isosceles. It would possess no particular size, yet still qualify as extended in space. This abstract idea represents all possible triangles by containing only their universal shared properties. Locke believed this mental operation distinguished human cognition from animal perception fundamentally. Berkeley declared this entire doctrine incoherent, impossible, and pernicious for philosophy and science. He argued that forming such abstract ideas is psychologically impossible for any mind whatsoever. Try to form an image or idea of a triangle with no particular shape. You cannot imagine extension that possesses no determinate length, width, or spatial configuration. Every mental image of a triangle you produce necessarily has some specific characteristics. It must be either right, obtuse, or acute in its angles necessarily. Berkeley insisted that all ideas in the mind are necessarily particular and determinate. When you think of a triangle, you imagine some specific triangle with particular properties. This particular idea can represent other triangles, but it never loses its own particularity. A drawing of one particular triangle on a blackboard represents all triangles in geometry. The geometer uses this specific triangle as a sign for the entire class, but the triangle itself remains utterly particular throughout the mathematical reasoning process. Berkeley's critique extended beyond psychological impossibility to logical contradictions in the doctrine itself. Consider Locke's example of an abstract idea of human or man in general. This idea supposedly contains what all humans share, while excluding what makes individuals different. But it must be both coloured and colourless, both short and tall, simultaneously. It possesses extension, yet no particular size, has shape, but no determinate form. These combinations involve manifest logical contradictions that no coherent idea could instantiate. Berkeley applied similar reasoning to abstract ideas of qualities like motion or extension. Motion in general would be neither fast nor slow, neither straight nor curved. Extension in general would be neither long nor short, neither one-dimensional nor three-dimensional. Such notions collapse under scrutiny into logical impossibilities rather than coherent mental contents. His rejection had profound implications for understanding how language and thought actually function. Words become general not by signifying abstract ideas, but by representing multiple particular ideas. The word triangle does not denote some impossible abstracted mental content unavailable to consciousness. It serves as a sign that can be applied to any particular triangle whatsoever. When I use the word, I may have some particular triangle image in mind, but the word's meaning extends to all triangles through this representative function and usage. Berkeley argued this account preserved everything useful about general terms without impossible abstractions. We can make universal claims and general statements without requiring abstract ideas as meanings. Mathematical reasoning proceeds perfectly well using particular diagrams that represent entire classes of figures. Scientific generalizations work through particular observations, standing in for broader patterns and regularities. The rejection of abstraction connected directly to Berkeley's assault on material substance itself. Locke had claimed we form an abstract idea of substance through mental operations. We experience particular qualities always appearing together in bundles or collections regularly. The mind supposedly abstracts the general notion of substance as whatever supports these properties. But Berkeley's critique demolished this move entirely as another impossible abstraction attempt. We cannot form any coherent idea of substance separated from all particular qualities whatsoever. Material substance, as philosophers conceived, it required this impossible act of abstraction necessarily. It supposedly exists as pure extension without any particular size or figure determined. It has solidity without any specific degree, exists in space without particular location. These descriptions employ precisely the contradictory abstract ideas Berkeley had exposed as incoherent. Therefore, the very concept of material substance collapses along with abstract ideas generally. We cannot coherently conceive what materialists claim their matter actually is supposed to be. Berkeley also challenged Locke's claim that abstraction distinguished humans from animals fundamentally. He observed that animals clearly use general recognition without possessing abstract ideas at all. A dog responds to the word sit across different contexts and situations appropriately. It generalizes from training to novel circumstances without forming Lockean abstract ideas, obviously. Children likewise use general terms correctly before they could possibly form complex abstractions. This suggests generality operates through different mechanisms than Locke supposed entirely. Berkeley proposed that selective attention explains apparent abstract thought without requiring impossible mental contents. When using a particular triangle to represent all triangles, I attend only to relevant features. I ignore the specific size while focusing on the three-sided, closed figure property. This selective focus allows the particular idea to function generally in reasoning and discourse. The particularity remains, but gets bracketed during the cognitive operation of generalization and representation. No impossible abstract content needs to exist in consciousness at any point whatsoever. This theory of general ideas, through representative particulars, influenced later philosophers profoundly and extensively. David Hume adopted Berkeley's critique nearly wholesale while developing his own empiricist system. The attack on abstraction became central to empiricist philosophy after Berkeley established the arguments. Even critics acknowledged the psychological difficulties in forming truly abstract ideas, as Locke described. Berkeley's polemic against abstraction served strategic purposes beyond mere epistemology and cognitive psychology. It removed key supports that materialist metaphysics required for its theoretical coherence and plausibility. Without abstract ideas, material substance became an incoherent notion lacking any clear content. The distinction between primary and secondary qualities likewise depended on problematic abstractions necessarily. Berkeley systematically dismantled the conceptual machinery supporting materialism through his critique of abstraction. His immaterialism emerged as the only coherent alternative once abstractions fell away completely. Modern cognitive science has complicated Berkeley's claims about abstraction substantially through empirical research. Prototype theory and exemplar models suggest multiple mechanisms for categorization operate in human cognition. Neural networks can represent categories without storing impossible abstract features explicitly in memory. Statistical learning and pattern recognition operate differently than either Berkeley or Locke envisioned clearly. Yet Berkeley's core insight about particularity retains force even given these developments significantly. Cognitive representations possess determinate features even when functioning to represent entire categories generally. Part 3. The master argument and primary-secondary quality distinction. Berkeley presented his famous master argument to prove that conceiving mind-independent objects is impossible. He challenged readers to perform a simple mental experiment with profound implications for metaphysics. Try to conceive of an object existing unconceived or unperceived by any mind whatsoever. As soon as you conceive the object, it exists in your mind during that conception. The very act of conceiving makes the object mind-dependent in that moment of thought. Therefore, you cannot coherently conceive of an absolutely mind-independent object existing entirely apart. Berkeley considered this argument so decisive he claimed to rest his entire case upon it. If we cannot conceive mind-independent existence, then asserting such existence becomes empty and meaningless. The materialist claims that objects exist outside all minds, but cannot make this claim intelligible. Every attempt to specify what this independent existence involves requires conceiving it in mind. The argument provoked immediate objections that continue generating scholarly debate even today persistently. Critics noted an apparent equivocation between two senses of conceiving something in this reasoning. In one sense, conceiving X means having X as the object of thought. In another sense, conceiving X means having an idea or representation of X in consciousness. When I conceive a tree existing unperceived, the tree becomes my thought's object. But this does not mean the tree itself exists in my mind as an idea. Berkeley might respond that this distinction collapses for him since objects just are ideas. The tree cannot exist as something distinct from ideas since nothing exists except ideas and minds. To conceive the tree is to have tree ideas in mind, which is the tree itself existing. Mind independence would require the tree to exist without being ideas in any mind, ever. But this describes nothing conceivable or intelligible according to Berkeley's analysis thoroughly and systematically. We cannot step outside our minds to compare mind-independent reality with our mental representations independently. The master argument connects intimately with Berkeley's demolition of the primary-secondary quality distinction thoroughly. John Locke and other mechanical philosophers distinguished two kinds of qualities fundamentally and categorically. Secondary qualities like colours, tastes, smells, sounds exist only in perceiving minds as subjective experiences. Primary qualities like shape, size, motion, solidity exist in material objects themselves independently of perception. Locke argued that our ideas of primary qualities resemble the qualities as they exist in objects. Our idea of a square shape resembles the actual square configuration in the material object. But our sensation of red does not resemble any property in the object causing redness. The object merely possesses microscopic structures that produce red sensations in normal observers under normal conditions. Berkeley systematically demolished this distinction through multiple converging arguments with devastating effect and precision. First, he showed that arguments proving secondary qualities, mind-dependent, apply equally to primary qualities. Colours appear differently, depending on lighting conditions, distance, and observer visual systems vary. These variations convinced Locke that colours exist only in minds as subjective sensations. But shapes also appear differently from different perspectives, distances, and viewing conditions equally. A circular coin looks oval when viewed from an angle rather than face-on. The same tower appears round from a distance, but square when approached closely in perception. Size varies with distance just as dramatically as colour varies with illumination changes. If variation proves secondary qualities mind-dependent, it proves primary qualities mind-dependent identically and equally. The argument generalizes without respecting the alleged distinction between these quality types at all. Berkeley deployed relativity arguments showing that thermal qualities challenge the primary-secondary distinction critically. Warmth appears primary to some philosophers but behaves exactly like acknowledged secondary qualities undeniably. Water feels warm to a cold hand, but cool to a warm hand simultaneously. The same liquid cannot possess opposite thermal properties simultaneously in itself, independently of perception. Therefore, warmth and coolness exist only relative to perceivers, as mind-dependent sensations exclusively. Yet warmth involves molecular motion, which materialists classified as primary motion and configuration properties. Second, Berkeley argued we cannot abstract primary from secondary qualities in actual perception or experience. Every experience of extension includes some colour or visual quality simultaneously and necessarily. Try to imagine extension that has no colour whatsoever while remaining visually perceivable still. It proves impossible, since visual extension always appears coloured or shaded in every concrete case. Similarly, tactile extension always possesses some texture, temperature, and resistance degree in concrete experience. We never encounter pure primary qualities isolated from secondary qualities in actual perceptual consciousness. Locke's distinction required abstracting primary from secondary qualities to conceive them separately and independently. But Berkeley had already demolished the possibility of such abstraction operations in his introduction comprehensively. If we cannot abstract primary qualities from secondary qualities in thought coherently, then we cannot conceive them existing separately in reality, independently, either logically. The distinction collapses as another instance of impossible abstraction infecting materialist metaphysics systematically throughout. Third, Berkeley challenged the resemblance claim that ideas of primary qualities resemble mind-independent reality accurately. He argued that ideas can only resemble other ideas, never anything fundamentally different in kind. An idea or sensation of extension cannot resemble extension existing independently outside all minds whatsoever. The very notion of resemblance requires comparing two terms, accessible to consciousness for comparison. We cannot compare our mind-dependent ideas with mind-independent reality, since accessing mind-independent reality requires having ideas of it, making it mind-dependent through that very access. The comparison becomes impossible in principle, not just practically difficult for finite human knowers. This likeness principle, as Berkeley called it, wielded considerable force against representationalist theories generally and systematically. If ideas represent material objects by resembling them, we need access to both terms. But we only ever access our own ideas immediately and directly in consciousness. The supposed mind-independent objects remain forever inaccessible behind the veil of perception and representation. We cannot verify the alleged resemblance, rendering the representationalist account epistemologically useless and metaphysically idle. Berkeley concluded that objects must be collections of ideas rather than causes of ideas existing separately. Fourth, Berkeley noted that pain provides a decisive counterexample to the primary-secondary distinction's coherence entirely. When I place my hand too near a fire, I feel intense pain localized in my hand clearly. Gap. Everyone agrees pain exists only in minds as subjective experience, not in material objects independently. But I simultaneously feel heat, which involves molecular motion that materialists classify as primary quality change. The pain and heat sensation are experienced as unified, occurring together in the same conscious episode. If pain exists only in the mind, and pain is inseparably united with heat sensation, then heat exists in mind too necessarily and inseparably. The argument extends to all supposedly primary qualities through similar inseparability considerations in actual lived experience. Berkeley pressed further by questioning what primary qualities could even mean divorced from perception entirely and completely. What is extension that no mind perceives, that exists independently of all possible experience whatsoever? Materialists claimed such extension exists as the essence of material substance itself fundamentally. But when we try to specify this supposed extension, we inevitably describe it using perceptual terms. Extension means spatial spread, having parts outside parts, occupying region of space determinately. All these characterizations presuppose spatial perception and experience as their basis and ground necessarily. The same problem afflicts motion, solidity, and other alleged primary qualities when examined rigorously and carefully. Motion means change of spatial position over time relative to other objects or reference frames. Solidity means resistance to penetration and compression by other objects attempting occupation of space. Every specification relies on perceptual or experiential content rather than purely abstract independent characterization successfully. Berkeley concluded that primary qualities are as mind-dependent as secondary qualities through and through. The distinction collapses under analysis, leaving all qualities as ideas existing only in minds perceiving them. These arguments eliminated the conceptual space for material substance to exist at all coherently and intelligibly. Material substance was defined as that which possesses primary qualities independently of any perception. Once primary qualities become mind-dependent ideas like secondary qualities, nothing remains for material substance to be. The entire materialist edifice collapses with its foundational distinction demolished completely and thoroughly. Modern philosophy of perception continues grappling with Berkeley's challenges to the primary-secondary quality distinction persistently. Scientific realism requires distinguishing objective physical properties from subjective experiential qualities in some fashion. Yet specifying this distinction without falling into Berkeley's traps proves remarkably difficult even today. Dispositionalist accounts define colours as dispositions to cause certain experiences in normal observers. But Berkeley's arguments about inseparability and abstraction challenge dispositional accounts too when examined carefully. Contemporary metaphysics employs sophisticated machinery to defend something like the primary-secondary distinction's successor. The master argument and quality distinction demolition together form Berkeley's positive case for immaterialism's truth necessarily. If we cannot conceive mind-independent existence and cannot distinguish mind-independent from mind-dependent qualities coherently, then immaterialism follows as the only intelligible metaphysical framework available to rational philosophical investigation, ultimately. Part 4. The Continuity Problem and God's Role. Berkeley's immaterialism immediately faces what philosophers call the problem of continuity or persistence fundamentally. If to be is to be perceived, then unperceived objects should not exist at all. When everyone leaves the room, the furniture apparently ceases existing according to Esse Percipi. When I close my eyes, the visible world vanishes into non-existence completely during that interval. Objects would continuously pop in and out of being with observation gaps and perceptual discontinuities. This consequence seems to violate common sense and undermine Berkeley's claim to defend ordinary beliefs. Berkeley offered multiple responses to this objection throughout his writings with varying degrees of success. His first strategy employed counterfactual conditionals to preserve unperceived object existence through possibility conditions. When I leave my office, my desk continues existing in the sense that I would perceive it if I returned. The desk's existence consists in the truth of conditionals about what experiences would occur under specified circumstances. God ensures these conditionals hold true through his orderly governance of experiential sequences and patterns. The desk exists as a permanent possibility of sensation rather than as continuously actualized perceptions. This phenomenalist interpretation attracted many 20th century philosophers seeking to defend empiricism against skepticism. It seems to preserve common sense while respecting Berkeley's core insight about perception and existence. Objects are logical constructions from actual and possible sensory experiences across potential observers and contexts. The truth of appropriate conditionals guarantees existence without requiring continuous actual perception by someone. However, the counterfactual analysis faces severe difficulties when pressed against Berkeley's own principles rigorously. The Esse est Percipi principle states that to be is to be actually perceived, not merely perceivable. Berkeley explicitly insisted that sensible things cannot exist unperceived, even potentially or conditionally. An idea or sensation that no mind perceives simply does not exist according to his fundamental metaphysics. The conditional, if I entered my office, I would perceive my desk, does not make the desk exist when I am absent from the office actually. It merely predicts what experience I would have under counterfactual circumstances involving my returning there. Berkeley himself seemed aware of this problem and offered a stronger theological solution more consistent with his principles. God perceives all objects continuously, ensuring their existence regardless of finite human observation patterns and gaps. When no human mind perceives the desk, it continues existing as ideas in God's infinite mind. Divine perception guarantees the stability and continuity of the physical world throughout temporal existence. Berkeley made this appeal explicit in his 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonas emphatically. The regularity and coherence of experience proves that an omniscient mind orders and sustains all ideas. This theological solution generated new problems that Berkeley struggled to resolve satisfactorily throughout his philosophical career. First, it seems to contradict traditional Christian theology about God's nature and attributes significantly. If objects exist as ideas in God's mind, then God possesses sensory ideas of colors, sounds, and tactile qualities. But God is traditionally conceived as utterly immaterial and incapable of having sensory experiences at all. Berkeley tried to distinguish between God's archetypal ideas and our sensory ectypal ideas of objects. God has perfect, eternal, unchanging ideas, while we have imperfect, temporal, changing sensory experiences of them. This distinction raises more questions than it resolves when examined carefully and skeptically throughout. If God's ideas differ fundamentally from our sensory ideas, how do they constitute the same objects? When I perceive a tree and God perceives the same tree, what makes them perceptions of one object rather than 2? Berkeley needed identity between divine and human ideas to solve continuity, but required difference to preserve divine transcendence. Reconciling these conflicting requirements proved extraordinarily difficult without compromising one constraint or the other significantly. Scholars debate whether Berkeley ever achieved a satisfactory solution to this theological tension in his system. Second, the appeal to divine perception threatened to make God the author of evil and suffering problematically. Pain exists as ideas in minds, according to Berkeley's system, without any exception or qualification. If all ideas exist in God's mind when unperceived by finite minds, then painful ideas exist in God. This seems to attribute suffering to an absolutely perfect being incapable of experiencing pain by definition. Berkeley tried to distinguish between God causing our pain sensations and God experiencing pain himself directly. But this move sits uncomfortably with his claim that all ideas exist in God's mind continuously. Third, some scholars argued that Berkeley's appeal to God was ad hoc, introduced solely to solve the continuity problem. The argument from sensory experience to immaterialism made no essential reference to divine perception at all. Berkeley added God afterward to rescue his system from an embarrassing consequence about discontinuous existence. This criticism may be too harsh, since Berkeley clearly had theological commitments independent of philosophical considerations. His works consistently integrated philosophy with Christian theology throughout every stage of his intellectual development. The God hypothesis served multiple functions beyond merely ensuring continuity of unperceived objects in his system. Berkeley also argued that immaterialism provided a stronger proof of God's existence than materialism ever could. If sensory ideas require a cause, and matter cannot cause anything as inert substance, then an intelligent spirit must cause our experiences as their origin and ground. The order, regularity, and coherence of sensory experience indicates an infinitely powerful and wise mind orchestrating phenomena. This design argument works better on immaterialist than materialist premises, according to Berkeley's own estimation. Materialists must explain how inert matter produces conscious experience and rational thought in human minds mysteriously. Berkeley's system avoided this problem entirely by making mind fundamental and matter derivative or non-existent completely. Yet the continuity problem admits another radical response that Berkeley briefly entertained, then rejected strategically. Perhaps unperceived objects simply do not exist, and this consequence is perfectly acceptable philosophically and scientifically. What matters is that objects exist whenever we need them and behave predictably according to laws. The gaps in existence during unperceived intervals make no practical difference to our lives or scientific theories. Berkeley showed some sympathy for this response in Principles sections 45 through 46. He suggested that materialists face similar problems about substance persisting through change and spatial discontinuity inevitably. This "who cares" response has appealing features, but undermines Berkeley's claim to vindicate common sense fully. Ordinary people believe that their furniture continues existing while they are absent from home, obviously. They do not think objects continuously flicker in and out of being with observation gaps occurring regularly. If Berkeley's philosophy contradicts this belief, it fails his own standard of preserving common sense against skepticism. Modern interpretations of Berkeley have proposed sophisticated solutions to the continuity problem using contemporary conceptual tools. Some scholars argue that Berkeley's account of objects as collections of ideas allows continued existence without continuous actual perception by anyone. The collection exists as a structured unity determined by laws of nature that God establishes and maintains consistently. Individual ideas come and go with particular perceptions, but the object persists as the lawful pattern itself. This reading makes Berkeley more of a phenomenalist than a straightforward idealist about object persistence conditions carefully examined. It remains controversial whether this interpretation fits Berkeley's actual texts and intentions faithfully or distorts them significantly. Kenneth Winkler proposed that Berkeley held a denial of blind agency principle, solving the continuity problem differently altogether. God acts according to regular laws in causing our sensory ideas, ensuring predictable experiential sequences and patterns. Objects exist as collections of ideas governed by these divinely ordained regularities rather than as continuously perceived items necessarily. This interpretation emphasizes Berkeley's philosophy of science and laws of nature over simple theological perception solutions exclusively. Other scholars argue that Berkeley never fully solved the continuity problem and recognized this limitation candidly. His various attempts represent different stages of his thinking about this persistent difficulty for immaterialism fundamentally. The problem may be endemic to any philosophy that makes perception essential to existence so completely. Modern quantum mechanics faces analogous issues about whether unobserved quantum systems possess determinate properties before measurement. The continuity problem reveals deep tensions in Berkeley's system between his phenomenological insights and his metaphysical commitments necessarily. His analysis of perception and experience suggested that objects are collections of actually perceived ideas exclusively. But common sense and scientific practice require objects to possess determinate existence independent of observation patterns. Reconciling these demands without appeal to God proved impossible within Berkeley's immaterialist framework, strictly maintained. The theological solution worked philosophically only by creating new theological problems about divine attributes and suffering substantially. Whether these problems outweigh the benefits remains a matter of ongoing scholarly and philosophical debate. Part 5. Berkeley's Philosophy of Science. Berkeley engaged deeply with the scientific developments of his time, despite his immaterialist metaphysics seemingly opposing science. His philosophy of science offered sophisticated analyses of causation, explanation, laws of nature, and theoretical entities. He wrote extensively on mathematics, physics, astronomy, and medicine throughout his philosophical career productively. His works on vision, calculus, and motion contributed substantially to scientific debates in the early 18th century. Berkeley's immaterialism required reconceptualizing scientific knowledge and practice without relying on material substance or mechanical causation. He accomplished this through a careful distinction between genuine causation and mere regular succession of phenomena. True causation involves an active power producing effects through will and intention necessarily. Only minds or spirits possess causal efficacy in this robust sense, according to Berkeley's metaphysics. Matter, being inert and passive, cannot cause anything whatsoever, even if it existed independently. Material objects cannot push, pull, heat, or move other objects through genuine causal powers at all. What then are physical laws and mechanical explanations, if not descriptions of causal processes among material objects? Berkeley reinterpreted them as descriptions of regular patterns in sensory experience rather than material mechanisms operating independently. When we observe that fire causes water to boil, we describe a constant conjunction of experiences. Fire sensations regularly precede boiling water sensations in our experience across many observations and contexts. This regularity allows prediction and control, but does not reveal genuine causal powers operating between material substances. The real cause is God producing our ideas according to stable laws that govern experiential sequences. Berkeley thus anticipated David Hume's regularity theory of causation by several decades in philosophical history. Both philosophers denied that we perceive necessary causal connections between events in our experience directly. We observe only constant conjunctions and temporal succession, not causal power itself transmitting between objects. Berkeley's theological framework provided what Hume's skepticism lacked, namely grounds for expecting regularities to continue holding. God's unchanging nature and consistent governance guarantee that natural laws remain stable over time reliably. This gave Berkeley's science firmer foundations than Hume's pure regularity account without theological support. In his work, De Motu, Berkeley developed these ideas into a systematic critique of Newtonian mechanics metaphysics. He accepted Newton's mathematical descriptions of motion and gravitational phenomena as empirically adequate and predictively successful. But he rejected Newton's interpretation of forces as real causal powers operating between material bodies mechanically. Gravitational force is not a real causal agent pulling objects toward each other through spatial action. It is a mathematical parameter describing regular patterns in how objects move relative to one another. The descriptions work for prediction without requiring forces to exist as mind-independent causal powers operating mechanically. Berkeley distinguished sharply between mathematical physics and metaphysical interpretations of its theoretical terms and equations. Physics describes how phenomena occur in law-like patterns without explaining why they occur through underlying mechanisms. The search for mechanical causes and material substrates is misguided philosophy interfering with good science. Science should restrict itself to describing observable regularities and developing mathematical laws for predictive purposes. Metaphysical speculation about hidden material causes adds nothing to scientific understanding or practical application. Berkeley advocated a kind of instrumentalism about theoretical entities and explanatory mechanisms in natural science. This philosophy of science appears remarkably modern, anticipating later positivist and instrumentalist approaches by centuries significantly. Ernst Mach praised Berkeley's analysis of scientific concepts in the 19th century extensively and approvingly. Mach's own phenomenalism and critique of absolute space drew inspiration directly from Berkeley's philosophical methodology. The logical positivists of the 20th century likewise found Berkeley's empiricism congenial to their verification principles. They admired his attempt to ground science in observable phenomena without metaphysical speculation about unobservables beyond experience. Berkeley's influence on philosophy of science extended far beyond what his immaterialism might suggest initially. Berkeley's theory of vision, in his essay Towards a New Theory of Vision, pioneered empirical psychology of perception. He argued that visual perception of distance and depth is learned through association with touch sensations, rather than immediately given visually. We do not directly see three-dimensional spatial arrangements as primitives of visual experience originally. Instead, we see two-dimensional patterns of light and color that become associated with tangible spatial properties. Through experience, certain visual patterns become signs predicting what we would feel if we reached out to touch objects. This associationist psychology influenced later empiricist theories of mind and learning extensively throughout the 18th century. Berkeley's analysis separated visual space from tactile space as distinct sensory modalities with different phenomenologies. The space we see differs qualitatively from the space we touch and move through practically. Visual extension consists of colored expanses lacking the resistance and solidity that tactile extension possesses essentially. Unity between these spaces arises through learned associations, not through immediate perception of common spatial properties. Modern neuroscience confirms Berkeley's insight that visual depth perception involves complex computational processes beyond simple sensation. The visual system integrates multiple cues like binocular disparity, motion parallax, and texture gradients to construct depth. These processes are partly learned through developmental experience, especially in early childhood periods of neural plasticity. Berkeley's emphasis on learning and association anticipated important discoveries about perceptual development and neural processing. His account of corpuscular theories in natural philosophy likewise demonstrated sophistication and careful analysis beyond simple rejection. Berkeley did not deny that scientists could usefully employ corpuscular explanations in their theorizing productively. He reinterpreted corpuscles as collections of ideas rather than mind-independent material particles existing independently of perception. Corpuscles are in principle observable with sufficiently powerful instruments, making them legitimate theoretical entities on his view. They qualify as ideas we could perceive under appropriate conditions, not fundamentally unperceivable substances forever. This preserved the utility of atomic theory while avoiding commitment to material substance metaphysics entirely. Berkeley insisted that corpuscles possess the same range of sensory qualities as ordinary macroscopic objects necessarily. He rejected the primary-secondary quality distinction for corpuscles, just as for everyday objects consistently. Corpuscles have colours, sounds, and tangible qualities, not just size, shape and motion, as mechanical philosophers claimed. This view seems bizarre from a modern scientific perspective, where fundamental particles lack sensory qualities, obviously. But Berkeley's point was that corpuscles must remain collections of possible sensory ideas to qualify as existing on immaterialist principles. They cannot be purely mathematical or geometrical entities devoid of all sensory content whatsoever. Berkeley's philosophy of mathematics proved more problematic and attracted significant criticism from mathematicians and philosophers alike. He rejected Newton and Leibniz's calculus based on infinitesimals as incoherent and logically contradictory reasoning. Infinitesimals are neither finite quantities nor absolute zeros, but supposedly infinitely small magnitudes in differential calculus. Berkeley argued this notion involves manifest contradictions and cannot be rigorously defined or consistently employed mathematically. His critique in The Analyst challenged mathematicians to provide clearer foundations for their infinitesimal methods rigorously. Some historians credit Berkeley with stimulating more careful attention to foundations in mathematical analysis subsequently. However, his positive account of mathematics as purely instrumental rather than discovering truths about reality seems inadequate. Berkeley suggested that mathematical reasoning works through compensating errors that yield correct results despite confused foundations. This instrumentalism about mathematics sits uncomfortably with the apparent objectivity and certainty of mathematical knowledge clearly. Modern mathematics resolve the infinitesimal problem through rigorous limit concepts that Berkeley did not anticipate adequately. Berkeley's scientific philosophy faced a fundamental tension between his empiricism and his immaterialism throughout his system. His empiricism demanded restricting knowledge to observable phenomena immediately given in sensory experience exclusively. His immaterialism required positing God as the cause of sensory ideas to solve continuity and coherence problems. But God is not observable through sensory experience, making divine causation metaphysical speculation by empiricist standards. Berkeley never fully resolved this tension between his epistemological empiricism and his theological metaphysics satisfactorily. Critics exploit this gap to argue that his system is ultimately incoherent or self-undermining in crucial respects. Despite these problems, Berkeley's philosophy of science contributed lasting insights about scientific methodology and theoretical interpretation substantially. His distinction between describing phenomena and explaining them through metaphysical causes remains relevant for contemporary philosophy. His critique of reifying theoretical entities anticipates ongoing debates about scientific realism versus instrumentalism in philosophy today. His emphasis on phenomenal regularities rather than hidden mechanisms influenced positivist and pragmatist movements profoundly. Berkeley showed that robust science is possible without commitment to material substance metaphysics explicitly. This achievement demonstrated that his immaterialism was not simply anti-scientific obscurantism, but a serious philosophical alternative. Part 6. Major critiques and philosophical responses. Berkeley's immaterialism provoked immediate and fierce opposition from philosophers, scientists, and ordinary educated readers alike. The most famous initial response came from Samuel Johnson, who allegedly refuted Berkeley by kicking a stone forcefully. Johnson declared, "I refute it thus," while his foot collided with solid resistant matter, obviously. James Boswell recorded this episode as demonstrating the obvious absurdity of Berkeley's denial of material substance. Yet Johnson's refutation completely misses Berkeley's actual position and commits a fundamental misunderstanding throughout. Berkeley never denied that we experience solidity, resistance, and impacts with objects in our sensory experience. He affirmed that these sensations are perfectly real and occur exactly as we perceive them consciously. His claim was that these sensations exist as ideas in minds rather than properties of mind-independent matter. Johnson's stone-kicking demonstrates only that he experiences resistance sensations, which Berkeley eagerly affirmed and explained consistently. The episode reveals how easily Berkeley's position can be caricatured into a denial of obvious experiential facts. Thomas Reid developed more sophisticated objections from his common-sense philosophy perspective in the Scottish Enlightenment tradition. Reid argued that Berkeley's system, despite intentions otherwise, leads inexorably towards skepticism about the external world necessarily. If we only ever perceive our own ideas, we cannot know whether external objects cause these ideas. Descartes used this reasoning to doubt everything except his own existence as thinking thing, fundamentally. Berkeley tried to avoid skepticism by eliminating the gap between ideas and objects entirely through identification. But Reid contended this move sacrifices common-sense belief in mind-independent reality unjustifiably and unnecessarily. Reid defended direct realism, claiming we perceive external objects immediately without mediating ideas intervening perceptually. Perception directly presents objects themselves, not representations or ideas standing between minds and reality obscuring access. This view seems to accord better with ordinary experience and belief than Berkeley's idealism does, obviously. When I see a tree, I seem to perceive the tree itself, not merely an idea of tree in my consciousness. Reid attributed the theory of ideas itself to philosophical confusion, corrupting natural common-sense beliefs unjustifiably. Both Berkeley and Locke accepted this problematic framework, leading them into various metaphysical absurdities and skeptical pitfalls. However, Reid's direct realism faces serious objections that Berkeley's arguments had already exposed quite effectively earlier. How can mind directly apprehend material substance fundamentally different in nature from consciousness itself? What relation obtains between immaterial mind and material object in direct perception that makes awareness possible? Reid offered few satisfactory answers to these questions, relying mainly on appeals to common sense and natural belief. Berkeley would respond that Reid's position simply assumes mind-independent objects exist without adequately defending this assumption. The theory of ideas arose from careful analysis of perception, not arbitrary philosophical invention distorting experience. David Hume engaged Berkeley's philosophy more sympathetically while extending empiricism beyond where Berkeley stopped deliberately. Hume adopted Berkeley's rejection of abstract ideas and critique of material substance almost entirely wholesale. He praised Berkeley's arguments as demonstrating the impossibility of conceiving matter existing independently of perception clearly. Yet Hume famously remarked that Berkeley's arguments admit of no answer and produce no conviction simultaneously. The reasoning appears sound, but fails to persuade because the conclusion seems absurd despite logical force. Hume attributed this to the natural power of imagination and custom overwhelming philosophical demonstration in practice. Hume extended Berkeley's empiricism to undermine the concept of spiritual substance alongside material substance consistently. If we have no impression of material substance, we likewise lack any impression of the self or mind as substance. Introspection reveals only bundles of particular perceptions succeeding each other rapidly in consciousness without stable underlying substrate. Hume thus dissolved both sides of Berkeley's dualism between ideas and spirits into streams of impressions exclusively. This move created its own problems about personal identity and unity of consciousness across time significantly. But it demonstrated that Berkeley's empiricist principles, consistently applied, undermine his own theistic metaphysics thoroughly and necessarily. Immanuel Kant engaged Berkeley more critically than Hume, viewing immaterialism as dogmatic idealism, requiring refutation fundamentally. Kant distinguished his transcendental idealism sharply from Berkeley's subjective idealism, despite surface similarities between positions superficially. For Kant, space and time are forms of intuition, structuring all possible experience transcendentally but necessarily. Objects in space possess empirical reality even though space itself is transcendently ideal as subjective form. This preserves objective knowledge of an empirical world while denying knowledge of things in themselves beyond experience. Berkeley supposedly made space and all spatial objects purely subjective illusions, depending entirely on contingent perception. Kant's refutation of idealism, in the Critique of Pure Reason, attempted to prove external objects exist necessarily. Self-consciousness of one's own existence in time requires experience of permanent objects in space as external reference. I cannot determine my existence as persisting through time without reference to unchanging spatial objects existing independently. Therefore, external objects must exist as conditions for the possibility of self-consciousness and temporal awareness itself. Scholars debate whether Kant successfully refuted Berkeley or merely refuted a caricature of Berkeley's actual position carefully. Berkeley did not claim spatial objects are illusions lacking all reality compared to imagination or dreams, obviously. He maintained that sensible objects are real collections of ideas with stable properties and law-like behavior patterns. The distinction between reality and illusion holds within Berkeley's framework through criteria like involuntariness and coherence. Kant may have misunderstood Berkeley's position due to reading only later works like Series, primarily. The Principles and Three Dialogues present Berkeley's immaterialism more clearly than his later mystical writings do. Nevertheless, Kant identified a genuine problem about temporal determination that Berkeley struggled to address satisfactorily throughout his corpus. If objects pop in and out of existence with perception gaps, temporal ordering becomes problematic. What grounds claims about when unobserved events occurred if objects don't exist unperceived continuously in time? Berkeley's appeal to God's perception may solve this, but Kant sought a solution within human cognition alone. Transcendental idealism grounds objective temporal order in a priori forms structuring all experience necessarily. This avoids both Berkeley's theological dependence and Reid's appeal to unexamined common-sense convictions uncritically accepted. Later, German idealists like Fichte, Schelling and Hegel developed absolute idealism, partly inspired by Berkeley's subjective idealism, significantly. They sought to overcome the subject-object dualism that Berkeley retained through his minds and ideas metaphysics throughout his system. Absolute idealism posited a universal mind or spirit realizing itself through nature and human consciousness, developing historically. This grandiose metaphysical system went far beyond Berkeley's relatively modest immaterialism, focused on sensory experience. Yet it shared Berkeley's conviction that reality is fundamentally mental or spiritual rather than material mechanistically. The lineage from Berkeley through Kant to German idealism represents a major stream in Western philosophical development. Arthur Schopenhauer praised Berkeley as one of philosophy's greatest thinkers, calling him the father of idealism explicitly. Schopenhauer built his own philosophy partly on Berkeleyan foundations while adding Kantian and Indian philosophical elements substantially. He distinguished between the world as representation, which is mind-dependent phenomena, and world as will underlying appearances. The world as representation follows Berkeley's insight that objects exist only for perceiving subjects necessarily. But Schopenhauer's metaphysics of will as thing in itself departed from Berkeley's theistic framework entirely and fundamentally. Schopenhauer's pessimism about existence contrasts sharply with Berkeley's optimistic Christian worldview throughout their systems. Bertrand Russell criticized Berkeley from a scientific realist perspective in the early 20th century extensively and systematically. Russell argued that physics requires matter existing independently of observation to make sense of scientific practice. Causal explanations trace how unobserved physical processes produce observed phenomena through complex mechanisms and interactions. Berkeley's phenomenalism cannot accommodate this explanatory structure without collapsing into incoherence or solipsism ultimately. Russell developed logical atomism and neutral monism, partly in response to perceived failures in Berkeleyan idealism. Yet Russell acknowledged that Berkeley's arguments about perception raised genuine problems for naive scientific realism unavoidably. Gilbert Ryle defended a form of phenomenalism influenced by Berkeley against mid-20th century behaviorism and materialism. He argued that mental concepts are dispositional rather than referring to inner Cartesian substances or episodes. This linguistic analysis aimed to dissolve mind-body problems by clarifying how mental vocabulary actually functions in ordinary language. Ryle's approach shared Berkeley's suspicion of substance metaphysics, while avoiding commitment to full-blown immaterialism explicitly. Contemporary philosophy of mind engages Berkeley's insights about consciousness and subjectivity in various ways, productively and critically. Phenomenological approaches emphasize the irreducibility of subjective experience to objective physical description, following Berkeley's lead substantially. The explanatory gap between physical brain processes and conscious experience echoes Berkeley's claims about mind-matter interaction difficulties. Yet most contemporary philosophers of mind reject Berkeley's idealism while grappling with problems he identified clearly. Quantum mechanics introduced new twists to debates about observation, reality, and mind independence that Berkeley's philosophy anticipated remarkably. The observer effect in quantum measurement suggests that observation plays a constitutive role in determining physical reality. Some interpretations, like cubism, adopt perspectives remarkably similar to Berkeley's about the mind dependence of physical states. Other interpretations, like many worlds realism, maintain mind-independent reality while accommodating quantum phenomena through different metaphysical frameworks. Berkeley's arguments about the impossibility of conceiving unperceived reality resurface in debates about quantum ontology surprisingly. Whether quantum mechanics vindicates or refutes Berkeley remains actively debated among philosophers of physics currently. Part 7. Influence and Legacy. Berkeley's philosophy exerted profound influence on later intellectual movements despite widespread rejection of his immaterialism directly. His empiricist methodology and critique of abstraction shaped epistemology for generations after his death permanently. The distinction between phenomenal experience and metaphysical speculation he emphasized became central to multiple philosophical traditions. His arguments about perception's role in constituting reality anticipated developments across philosophy, psychology, and physics remarkably. Phenomenalism emerged as Berkeley's most direct philosophical descendant in 19th and 20th century analytical philosophy substantially. John Stuart Mill developed classical phenomenalism by reinterpreting physical objects as permanent possibilities of sensation explicitly. Objects exist not as continuously perceived ideas, but as reliable dispositions to produce sensory experiences under specified conditions. A table in an empty room exists because entering that room would produce table sensations reliably and predictably. Mill's formulation avoided Berkeley's theological commitments while preserving empiricist scruples about unobservable entities problematically. It translated metaphysical claims about objects into claims about conditional sensory experiences across possible observers systematically. Ernst Mach extended phenomenalism into philosophy of science with radical empiricist rigor during the late 19th century. He argued that physical theories should describe relations among observable phenomena without positing unobservable substances or forces. Newton's absolute space and time were metaphysical illusions to be eliminated from proper physics entirely. Only relative motions among observable bodies possess scientific meaning and empirical content verifiable through experience. Mach explicitly acknowledged Berkeley as inspiration for this phenomenalist approach to scientific knowledge and methodology. His analysis of sensations developed Berkeley's insights about perception into a sophisticated neutral monism framework systematically. Mach influenced Albert Einstein's development of relativity theory through this Berkeleyan critique of absolute space substantially. Einstein recognized that only observable relative motions matter for physics, not motion relative to unobservable absolute space. Special relativity eliminated absolute simultaneity, making temporal ordering observer-dependent exactly as spatial position was always observer-dependent. General relativity identified gravity with space-time curvature rather than a force acting between material bodies mysteriously. These developments vindicated Berkeley's instrumentalism about theoretical entities and forces in certain respects significantly. Physics could eliminate metaphysical posits like absolute space while improving empirical adequacy and predictive power simultaneously. The Vienna Circle. Logical positivists adopted phenomenalism as their preferred metaphysics during the early 20th century systematically. Rudolf Carnap attempted to reconstruct all physical object statements as logical constructions from sense data statements formally. His Aufbau project aimed to show that scientific knowledge reduces to immediate phenomenal experience through logical analysis. Every meaningful statement about physical objects should translate into statements about actual and possible sensory experiences verifiable empirically. This verification principle embodied Berkeley's empiricist spirit while employing modern logical tools unavailable in his time. Physical objects became logical constructions, serving as convenient summaries of sensory regularities rather than independent existence, fundamentally. However, the phenomenalist program encountered severe technical difficulties that ultimately led to its abandonment generally. Carnap could never complete his reduction of physical object language to sense data language satisfactorily or completely. The translation required infinite disjunctions of conditionals specifying every possible observational circumstance exhaustively and precisely. No finite set of sense data statements captures what we mean by asserting that a physical object exists. W.V.O. Quine's critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction further undermined phenomenalism's foundational assumptions about meaning. By the 1950s, most analytical philosophers abandoned phenomenalism as an untenable position despite its initial attractions. Yet phenomenalism's failure did not erase Berkeley's influence on philosophy of perception and epistemology more broadly. His arguments about the primacy of phenomenal experience continued shaping debates through indirect channels and reformulated positions. Direct realism had to answer Berkeley's challenges about how minds access mind-independent objects directly without mediation. Representative realism faced Berkeley's objections about verifying resemblance between ideas and independent reality behind them. Phenomenology developed as a distinct philosophical movement with complex relations to Berkeley's empiricism and idealism significantly. Edmund Husserl founded phenomenology as rigorous descriptive science of consciousness and intentional experience systematically during early 20th century. His method involved bracketing existence questions about external reality to describe subjective experiences' essential structures. This epoche or phenomenological reduction bears resemblance to Berkeley's focus on ideas immediately present in consciousness. However, Husserl explicitly distinguished phenomenology from psychologism and Berkeley's subjective idealism sharply and repeatedly. Phenomenology studies ideal essences and intentional structures, not merely psychological facts about human perception, contingently. Husserl's later transcendental idealism claimed that objects are constituted through consciousness while possessing objective validity transcendentally. This differs from Berkeley's straightforward claim that objects are collections of ideas existing only when perceived actually. Husserl accused Berkeley of psychological reductionism that confused philosophical analysis with empirical psychology of mental processes. True phenomenology requires distinguishing between psychological acts and ideal contents they intend as objects systematically. Despite Husserl's criticisms, scholarly debates continue about deeper affinities between phenomenology and Berkeleyan idealism substantially. Both traditions emphasize first-person experiential perspective as foundational for understanding reality and knowledge fundamentally. Both reject naive realism that ignores consciousness's constitutive role in experience and object awareness essentially. Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception developed themes about embodiment and sensoromotor contingencies resonating with Berkeley's theory of vision. Merleau-Ponty argued that perception is not passive reception but active exploration through bodily interaction with environment. This echoes Berkeley's claim that visual space acquires meaning through learned associations with tangible spatial experience developmentally. American pragmatism engaged Berkeley through both admiration and critique during its classical period from 1870 through 1940. William James developed radical empiricism that shares Berkeley's emphasis on pure experience as fundamental reality underlying subject-object distinctions. James argued that consciousness is not a substantial entity but a function organizing experiential contents into meaningful patterns. His neutral monism treated minds and physical objects as different organizations of fundamentally homogeneous experiential elements. This view parallels Berkeley's reduction of objects to ideas while avoiding his substance dualism between spirits and ideas completely. James explicitly acknowledged Berkeley's influence while rejecting his theistic metaphysics and epistemological idealism ultimately and fundamentally. Charles Sanders. Peirce criticized Berkeley's nominalism about universals while appreciating his emphasis on practical consequences of beliefs. Peirce's pragmatic maxim stated that concept's meaning consists entirely in its conceivable practical effects on experience. This echoes Berkeley's claim that hypotheses about unobservable matter lack meaning if they make no experiential difference. Peirce developed this into sophisticated semiotic theory, where reality is what would be agreed upon by ideal inquirers ultimately. His realism about universals and scientific laws departed from Berkeley's nominalist empiricism significantly and deliberately. Yet both philosophers emphasized that meaningful thought must connect to possible experience and observable consequences verifiably. John Dewey's instrumentalism about ideas and scientific theories shows Berkeley's influence filtered through pragmatist transformations substantially. Dewey treated ideas as tools for organizing experience and solving practical problems rather than mental representations. Physical objects are stable patterns of potential experiences that guide successful action and prediction reliably across contexts. This functional interpretation of objectivity avoids both Berkeley's idealism and naive scientific realism about mind-independent entities. Dewey's naturalism rejected supernatural explanations, including Berkeley's appeal to divine causation-solving continuity problems necessarily. But his emphasis on experience as primary datum for philosophy remained thoroughly Berkeleyan in spirit fundamentally. Quantum mechanics introduced surprising connections to Berkeley's philosophy during early 20th century physics revolutions dramatically. The Copenhagen interpretation emphasized that quantum systems lack determinate properties until observation or measurement collapses wave functions. Observation appears to play a constitutive role in determining physical reality, rather than merely revealing pre-existing properties passively. This raised philosophical questions about whether unobserved quantum objects exist in determinate states at all. Niels Bohr's complementarity principle suggested that quantum phenomena cannot be described independently of experimental arrangements measuring them. Bohr emphasized that classical concepts only apply within specific experimental contexts, not absolutely to quantum systems themselves. This contextual dependence of physical properties resonates with Berkeley's arguments about perception's essential role in constituting objects. Some physicists and philosophers drew explicit parallels between quantum measurement and Berkeleyan idealism about observation. Fritz London and Edmund Bauer developed phenomenological interpretation of quantum measurement incorporating consciousness explicitly in process. They argued that wave function collapse occurs when conscious observer becomes aware of measurement outcome registering consciously. This view made consciousness fundamental to quantum mechanics in ways reminiscent of Berkeley's immaterialism, surprisingly. Most physicists rejected this interpretation as unnecessary anthropocentrism, introducing mind into physics artificially. Yet the measurement problem continues generating interpretations that echo Berkeley's insights about observation and reality persistently. Cubism or quantum Bayesianism treats quantum states as representing observers' beliefs rather than objective physical properties independently. John Wheeler's participatory universe hypothesis suggested that observation by conscious observers literally brings universe into existence retroactively. Quantum mechanics allows delayed choice experiments where present observations determine past physical states, apparently backwards in time. Wheeler speculated that consciousness participates in creating reality rather than passively observing independently existing physical facts. These ideas pushed Berkeleyan themes to cosmological extremes far beyond anything Berkeley himself contemplated explicitly. However, most physicists favor interpretations preserving realism about unobserved quantum states without invoking consciousness or idealism necessarily. Many worlds interpretation posits that all possible measurement outcomes occur in different branches of universal wave function simultaneously. Decoherence theory explains apparent collapse through environmental interactions without requiring consciousness or observation essentially fundamental. Bohmian mechanics provides deterministic hidden variable theory where particles possess definite positions always independently of measurement. These realist alternatives suggest that quantum mechanics need not vindicate Berkeley despite initial appearances of affinity significantly. The connections remain philosophically intriguing but scientifically controversial among practicing physicists currently and predominantly. Cognitive science and neuroscience engage Berkeley's theory of vision and perception research throughout 20th and 21st centuries. His emphasis on learning and neural plasticity and perceptual development anticipated modern developmental psychology findings substantially. Studies of cataract patients gaining sight after congenital blindness confirm that visual space perception develops through experience. Depth perception and object recognition require extended learning periods, integrating visual input with other sensory modalities developmentally. Sensory-motor contingency theory in contemporary perception research echoes Berkeley's insights about active exploration constituting perceptual awareness fundamentally. Kevin O'Regan and Alva Noe argue that perception consists in practical knowledge of how sensations change with movement. Seeing involves knowing implicitly how visual appearance varies with eye movements and body position changes systematically. This view treats perception as inactive engagement with environment rather than passive reception of sensory inputs. The parallels with Berkeley's account of vision through touch associations are striking, though not identical in theoretical framework. Modern theories incorporate neural mechanisms and computational processes that Berkeley could not have anticipated in his time. Predictive processing frameworks in neuroscience model perception as active inference rather than bottom-up sensation processing passively. The brain constantly generates predictions about sensory input, updating these predictions when actual input deviates from expectations. This active constructive process resonates with Berkeley's claim that perception involves mind's organization rather than mere reception. However, these theories operate within naturalistic framework, treating mental processes as brain functions physically realized. They do not support Berkeley's immaterialism or his dualism between minds and ideas fundamentally at all. The influence remains at level of emphasizing perception's active constructive character rather than metaphysical conclusions drawn. Part 8. Modern Implications and Scientific Connections. Berkeley's philosophy intersects surprisingly with contemporary neuroscience research on consciousness and perception, despite apparent incompatibility initially. The hard problem of consciousness, identified by David Chalmers, asks why physical brain processes produce subjective experiential qualities. Why does seeing red feel like something rather than occurring as unconscious information processing mechanically? This explanatory gap between objective physical description and subjective phenomenal experience parallels Berkeley's arguments about mind-matter interaction. Berkeley claimed that matter and mind are fundamentally different kinds, making their interaction philosophically mysterious and problematic. He resolved this by eliminating matter entirely, making consciousness primary and sensory qualities mental from start. Contemporary philosophers of mind face similar difficulties, explaining how brain states generate conscious experiences through purely physical processes. Some argue that consciousness cannot be reduced to physical processes, requiring new fundamental properties in nature. Panpsychism posits that experiential properties exist throughout physical world at fundamental level, not just in complex brains. This view shares Berkeley's conviction that mind or experience is more fundamental than inert matter metaphysically. However, most neuroscientists pursue research programs assuming consciousness emerges from brain activity without requiring immaterialism explicitly. Neural correlates of consciousness research identifies specific brain processes associated with particular conscious experiences systematically. Damage to certain brain regions eliminates corresponding conscious functions predictably and reproducibly across patients studied. This strong correlation between brain states and conscious states suggests physical dependence regardless of metaphysical interpretation ultimately. Berkeley could interpret these findings as showing how God coordinates certain ideas with other ideas lawfully. Brain state ideas regularly accompany conscious experience ideas because God maintains stable patterns in the divine order. The binding problem in neuroscience asks how diverse neural processes produce unified conscious experience coherently integrated temporally. Visual processing occurs in separate brain areas for color, motion, shape, and spatial location independently initially. Yet we experience unified visual scenes where objects possess colors, shapes, and motions together as integrated wholes. How does the brain bind these separate processes into coherent conscious perceptions phenomenologically unified? Berkeley's account of objects as unified collections of ideas faces analogous questions about what unifies disparate sensory qualities. He appealed to regular co-occurrence and divine causation maintaining stable patterns, which parallels neural synchronization theories proposed currently. Predictive coding models of brain function offer frameworks potentially compatible with Berkeleyan insights about perception's constructive nature significantly. The brain continuously generates top-down predictions about sensory input, comparing these with actual bottom-up signals received. Perception emerges from minimizing prediction errors through updating internal models of environmental causes producing sensations. This active inference process treats perception as hypothesis testing rather than passive reception of external stimuli directly. Carl Friston's free energy principle extends this framework to encompass all biological self-organization and adaptive behavior systematically. Organisms maintain their integrity by minimizing surprise or uncertainty about sensory states they occupy statistically over time. This requires building internal models that predict and explain sensory input through inferred environmental causes acting externally. The mathematical formalism treats perception and action as unified process of active inference about hidden environmental states. While developed within naturalistic neuroscience, this framework resonates with Berkeley's emphasis on minds actively organizing sensory experience. The hidden states inferred through prediction might be reinterpreted as stable patterns in sensory regularities rather than mind-independent causes. Virtual reality technology provides contemporary illustrations of Berkeley's core insights about perception and reality unexpectedly and dramatically. Users wearing VR headsets experience richly detailed three-dimensional environments that feel compellingly real, experientially, despite being computer-generated. The virtual objects possess visual appearance, auditory properties, and even haptic feedback through controllers stimulating touch receptors. These objects exist only as patterns of sensory stimulation coordinated by computer algorithms generating experiences systematically. Nothing material corresponding to virtual objects exists in the headset or computer hardware physically at all. Yet users perceive coherent, stable objects that behave according to physical laws and can be interacted with practically. This situation mirrors Berkeley's metaphysics remarkably, where objects are collections of ideas caused by God's orderly governance. Virtual reality substitutes computer software for divine causation, but structural similarity remains striking philosophically and conceptually. The experience seems indistinguishable from perceiving real objects despite different causal mechanisms producing sensations received consciously. Berkeley's challenge about distinguishing real from imaginary perceptions finds new expression in questions about virtual versus physical reality. If sensory qualities alone constitute objects, then sufficiently sophisticated VR creates genuine objects phenomenologically indistinguishable from physical ones. This supports Berkeley's claim that material substance adds nothing to sensory appearances we actually experience directly. Simulation hypothesis in contemporary philosophy and physics pushes these ideas to radical conclusions about entire universe possibly. Some physicists and philosophers speculate that our reality might be computer simulation run by advanced civilizations or beings. If simulation is sophisticated enough, inhabitants cannot distinguish their simulated existence from genuine physical reality empirically or experientially. All evidence available to them comes through simulated perceptions produced by computational processes rather than physical objects. This scenario realizes Berkeley's immaterialism literally, where reality consists of coordinated experiences without underlying material substance existing independently. God's role in maintaining sensory order gets replaced by simulation programmers maintaining consistency in generated experiences systematically. However, simulation hypothesis faces similar objections to those Berkeley encountered about explanatory adequacy and parsimony ultimately. Why posit simulators and computers beyond our access rather than accepting physics as describing fundamental reality directly? The hypothesis seems unfalsifiable, since any evidence could be programmed into the simulation by hypothetical creators deliberately. Berkeley faced analogous charges that God's perception was unfalsifiable metaphysical speculation beyond empirical verification or scientific testing. Information theory offers another domain where Berkeleyan themes resurface in contemporary scientific discourse about reality's nature fundamentally. Some physicists propose that information is more fundamental than matter or energy as basic constituent of physical reality. John Wheeler's "It from Bit" slogan suggested that physical reality emerges from information-theoretic processes rather than material substance. Quantum mechanics can be formulated entirely in terms of information processing and correlation patterns among quantum systems mathematically. This informational ontology shares Berkeley's rejection of inert matter as fundamental while emphasizing relational patterns and structures instead. However, information requires physical substrates to instantiate it in contemporary physics, unlike Berkeley's purely mental ideas existing. Quantum information theory studies how quantum systems store, process and transmit information through characteristically quantum phenomena displayed experimentally. Quantum entanglement creates non-local correlations between particles that classical information theory cannot explain using local hidden variables. These correlations might be interpreted as relational properties among observational contexts rather than intrinsic properties of particles themselves. Relational quantum mechanics explicitly adopts this perspective, treating quantum states as observer-relative rather than absolute features. This approach echoes Berkeley's insistence that properties exist only relative to perceivers, not as mind-independent qualities. Yet relational interpretations maintain realism about quantum systems existing independently while making their properties perspectival and contextual. Cognitive linguistics and embodied cognition research programs incorporate insights resonating with Berkeley's theory of meaning and concepts substantially. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson argue that abstract concepts derive from embodied sensorimotor experience through metaphorical extensions systematically. Mathematical and logical reasoning build on spatial cognition and physical manipulation schemas acquired through bodily interaction with environment. This embodiment thesis parallels Berkeley's claim that abstract ideas reduce to particular sensory images functioning representatively in thought. Concepts possess meaning through grounding in concrete perceptual and motor experience rather than formal abstract definitions alone. Berkeley's rejection of abstraction anticipated embodied cognition's emphasis on perception and action underlying conceptual thought fundamentally. However, contemporary cognitive science operates within naturalistic framework, treating minds as evolved biological systems implementing information processing. Embodied cognition does not imply idealism or immaterialism about physical bodies doing the cognition and perceiving, obviously. The brain and body are physical systems whose operations produce mental phenomena according to standard neuroscientific understanding. Berkeley's immaterialism finds no support in contemporary cognitive science, despite methodological affinities about perception's centrality. Social constructionism in sociology and science studies echoes Berkeley's emphasis on mind dependence of reality without endorsing his metaphysics explicitly. Thomas Kuhn argued that scientific revolutions involve changes in conceptual frameworks constituting what counts as reality for scientists. Paradigm shifts transform not just theories, but the perceived world that theories describe, making reality paradigm dependent partially. This resonates with Berkeley's claim that objects exist relative to frameworks for organizing sensory experience into meaningful patterns. However, Kuhn maintained realism about mind-independent nature even while emphasizing theory-ladenness of observation and conceptual relativism significantly. He did not endorse idealism claiming nature itself depends on human cognition or social practices fundamentally. Cultural psychology and anthropology document enormous variation in perceptual and cognitive practices across human cultures extensively and systematically. Color perception, spatial reasoning, numerical cognition, and causal understanding vary with cultural context and linguistic structures substantially. This cultural variation might suggest that reality is constructed through cultural practices rather than directly perceived independently. Berkeley's framework could accommodate this variation as different minds organizing sensory ideas according to different patterns and habits. But cultural variation is more naturally explained as different ways of perceiving and conceptualizing shared physical reality existing independently. Universal features of human perception across cultures suggest biological constraints imposed by shared neural architecture and environmental physics law. Artificial intelligence and machine learning raise new questions about perception, consciousness and reality relevant to Berkeleyan themes substantially. Can computer systems genuinely perceive if they process sensory information and extract meaningful patterns from environmental input? Do neural networks that recognize objects possess something analogous to perceptual ideas in Berkeley's sense of mental contents? These questions force clarification of what perception involves beyond mere information processing without conscious awareness accompanying it. Berkeley would likely deny that unconscious computational processes constitute genuine perception requiring conscious ideas experienced subjectively. But functional criteria for perception might license attributing perceptual states to sophisticated AI systems, lacking phenomenal consciousness entirely. Large language models demonstrate remarkable linguistic competence and apparent reasoning abilities without necessarily possessing conscious understanding or meaning. These systems generate text by predicting probable next words based on statistical patterns in training data extensively. Do they genuinely understand language or merely simulate understanding through sophisticated pattern matching computationally without meaning? Berkeley's theory of meaning emphasized connection to sensory ideas and practical consequences rather than formal symbol manipulation alone. Contemporary debates about AI understanding and consciousness revive questions about what minds are and whether purely computational processes suffice. Berkeley's insistence on conscious ideas as essential to mental life challenges functionalist accounts reducing minds to information processing patterns. Climate science and ecological research emphasize observer dependence in different sense from Berkeley's idealism, but raising related epistemological issues. Environmental monitoring requires coordinating observations across different measurement systems, scales and perspectives to construct integrated understanding of Earth systems. The view from nowhere proves impossible, since all observations occur from particular perspectives using specific instruments and methods necessarily. This practical observer dependence differs from Berkeley's metaphysical claim that objects exist only when perceived by conscious minds. Yet both recognize that our knowledge of reality is inescapably perspectival, mediated through observational practices and conceptual frameworks. Environmental science succeeds by coordinating multiple perspectives into coherent models rather than eliminating perspective dependence entirely through impossible objectivity. Part 9. Fundamental Limitations and Unresolved Problems. Berkeley's philosophical system contains internal tensions and unresolved difficulties that scholars continue debating after 3 centuries persistently. These problems reveal fundamental limitations in his immaterialist framework that no interpretation fully resolves satisfactorily or definitively. The continuity problem, discussed earlier, remains Berkeley's most notorious difficulty despite various attempted solutions throughout his writings. His Esse est Percipi principle directly implies that unperceived objects do not exist during observation gaps necessarily. The counterfactual analysis fails because conditionals about possible perception do not make objects actually exist when unperceived currently. The theological solution faces difficulties explaining how God perceives objects without having sensory experiences himself, impossibly. No proposed solution preserves both Berkeley's core principles and common-sense belief in continuous existence fully consistently. This fundamental tension suggests that making perception essential to existence creates unavoidable metaphysical problems about persistence through time. Scholars debate whether Berkeley's phenomenalism or his idealism provides his authentic position on object continuity throughout different texts. Early works like the philosophical commentaries show Berkeley experimenting with different solutions before settling on published views. The principles emphasizes counterfactual conditionals, while 3 Dialogues appeals more explicitly to God's sustaining perception throughout reality. Later works like Series develop mystical themes about divine ideas that complicate the picture further substantially. Whether these represent evolution, inconsistency or complementary approaches remains unresolved among Berkeley scholars currently and contentiously. The textual evidence permits multiple interpretations without decisive resolution, favoring any single reading conclusively over alternatives. Berkeley's account of other minds faces severe epistemological problems that he never adequately addressed in his published philosophical works. If I perceive only my own ideas directly, how can I know that other minds exist beyond my consciousness? Berkeley argued that I infer other minds from observing intelligent, purposeful behavior in bodies I perceive around me regularly. These bodies exhibit signs of rational agency that require explanation through positing other perceiving active spirits causing them. But this argument seems weak compared to his general skepticism about inferring unobserved entities from observed phenomena systematically. Why trust inference to other minds when he rejected inference to material substance using remarkably similar reasoning patterns? The asymmetry between his treatment of matter and other minds appears arbitrary and undermines his system's logical consistency critically. Both material objects and other minds transcend my direct conscious experience, being inferred from patterns in my ideas. Berkeley's empiricism should lead to solipsism, where only my mind and its ideas are certain to exist. He recoiled from this consequence, but never provided principled reasons for accepting other minds while rejecting matter consistently. Some commentators argue that Berkeley's theism committed him to other finite minds alongside divine mind necessarily from start. But this makes his rejection of matter seem like arbitrary preference rather than empiricist conclusion following necessarily from principles. Berkeley's theology creates additional problems about divine attributes that his philosophy exacerbates rather than resolves satisfactorily at all. If God perceives all sensory ideas to maintain their continuous existence, does God experience pain and suffering? Christian theology traditionally denies that God experiences pain or any passive affections incompatible with perfect divine nature. Berkeley tried distinguishing between God-causing pain ideas in finite minds versus God experiencing pain himself directly and passively. But this distinction seems ad hoc and undermines the claim that objects exist as ideas in God's mind, literally. If God's ideas differ fundamentally from ours, they cannot be the same objects perceived from different perspectives coherently. The problem of evil intensifies under Berkeley's immaterialism, since God directly causes all sensory experiences, including suffering, necessarily. Material substance might deflect responsibility by providing intermediate causes between God and human pain, independent of divine will. But Berkeley eliminated this buffer, making God the immediate cause of every painful sensation experienced by conscious beings. He argued that suffering serves pedagogical purposes in teaching finite minds about natural laws and moral consequences systematically. Pain serves as a natural language through which God communicates information about dangerous situations requiring avoidance for survival. This theodicy seems inadequate for extreme suffering, serving no apparent instructive purpose, like childhood diseases causing death. Berkeley's account of causation contains unresolved tensions between his occasionalism and his attribution of genuine agency to finite minds. He claimed that only spirits possess genuine causal powers, while ideas remain entirely passive without causal efficacy. But he also insisted that God is the real cause of sensory ideas in our minds, not finite spirits acting independently. This makes human agency mysterious, since our volitions apparently cause nothing if God produces all ideas directly. Berkeley tried to preserve human free will while making God's causation universal, but the reconciliation remains obscure and problematic. How do finite minds genuinely act if their volitions merely accompany divinely caused ideas rather than producing effects independently? His philosophy of mathematics and geometry reveals fundamental problems about abstract objects and necessary truths beyond sensory experience. Mathematical truths seem universal and necessary, not dependent on contingent sensory experiences in any particular mind, temporally. Triangles possess properties that hold necessarily regardless of whether anyone thinks about triangles at any particular moment. Berkeley tried to explain mathematical necessity through God's eternal ideas, serving as archetypes for our particular geometrical ideas. But this seems to reintroduce abstract entities that his critique of abstraction should exclude entirely from ontology consistently. God's eternal idea of triangle serves the same function as Platonic forms that Berkeley explicitly rejected as incoherent. The status of unperceived scientific entities like atoms and subatomic particles creates difficulties for Berkeley's phenomenalism about theoretical entities. He claimed that corpuscles are perceivable in principle, with sufficiently powerful microscopes, making them legitimate ideas, potentially experienced. But modern physics posits entities like quarks and electrons whose properties preclude direct perception fundamentally by any possible observer. Quantum field excitations, space-time singularities, and other theoretical posits seem necessarily unobservable, while being scientifically indispensable currently. Berkeley's empiricist strictures against unobservable entities would eliminate much of modern physics as meaningless metaphysical speculation improperly. Defending scientific realism about these entities requires abandoning Berkeley's phenomenalist constraints on legitimate ontology substantially. Berkeley's treatment of time and temporal relations remains underdeveloped compared to his extensive discussions of space and spatial perception. He argued that succession of ideas in consciousness provides basis for temporal awareness and time's passage experienced subjectively. But what grounds objective temporal order among events, including unperceived events occurring simultaneously at different locations spatially? If objects exist only when perceived, temporal relations between unperceived events become problematic or undefined entirely. God's eternal perspective seems outside time altogether, making divine perception unsuitable for grounding temporal succession among worldly events. Berkeley never developed systematic philosophy of time comparable to his spatial analysis in the new theory of vision comprehensively. His account of natural laws and scientific explanation faces the problem of distinguishing genuine laws from accidental regularities in experience. Why do certain regularities reflect true laws, while others are merely coincidental patterns occurring temporarily or locally? Berkeley appealed to God's consistent governance as grounding natural law necessity, but this seems to conflate divine will with natural necessity. Gap. If God could change laws arbitrarily, they lack the necessity that scientific laws apparently possess objectively and universally. Yet, if God must follow certain laws necessarily, this suggests laws are independent of divine will, contrary to Berkeley's voluntarism. The tension between divine freedom and natural law necessity remains unresolved in Berkeley's theological scientific framework fundamentally. Berkeley's semantic theory about how language acquires meaning through ideas creates problems for intersubjective communication and shared meaning. If words signify ideas in individual minds, how do different people use the same words meaningfully in communication? My idea of red differs from your idea of red in various ways, given our different perceptual systems and experiences. What makes us communicate successfully using the word red if we signify different private mental contents with it? Berkeley's theory seems to lead toward private language, where each person's words signify only their own incommunicable ideas exclusively. He tried to address this through emphasis on practical utility and behavioral dispositions rather than exact idea-sharing requirements. But this pragmatic move sits uneasily with his representational theory treating ideas as meanings of words in consciousness directly. Contemporary philosophy of language rejected this ideational semantics for public language games and use-based meaning theories substantially. The relationship between sensory qualities and physical magnitude measurements raises problems for Berkeley's philosophy of science and mathematics critically. He rejected infinitesimals and precise mathematical quantities as applied to physical extension actually experienced in sensation continually. But scientific measurement requires assigning exact numerical values to physical quantities like length, mass, and time intervals precisely. How do approximate sensory qualities ground precise quantitative measurements if objects are just collections of qualitative sensory ideas? Berkeley's response emphasized that mathematical precision applies to relations among ideas rather than ideas themselves possessing exact magnitudes. Yet this seems to reintroduce abstract mathematical objects independent of particular sensory experiences, undermining his empiricist strictures consistently. His voluntarism about divine causation, combined with empiricism about human knowledge, creates tension about discovering natural laws through experience. If God freely chooses which regularities to instantiate, natural laws could be completely different, or change arbitrarily potentially. Empirical investigation reveals only actual regularities, not whether God must maintain them or might alter them capriciously tomorrow. This threatens scientific inference from past experience to future expectations, since regularities depend on divine will, potentially variable. Berkeley needed God's constancy to ground induction, but had theological reasons to preserve divine freedom in creation and governance. Balancing these requirements without making God either bound by necessity or capriciously arbitrary remained problematic throughout his system. Modern developments in logic and semantics reveal limitations in Berkeley's theory of abstract ideas and general terms more clearly. Frege distinguished sense from reference, showing that words signify concepts mediating between words and objects denoted extensionally. This framework explains how different descriptions refer to same object and how empty names possess meaning despite lacking reference. Berkeley's rejection of abstract ideas as mediating concepts eliminates resources for explaining these semantic phenomena adequately by modern standards. Quantification over domains requires variable binding operators and abstract domains that Berkeley's nominalism cannot easily accommodate within framework. Mathematical logic's success using abstract structures suggests that eliminative nominalism about abstractions faces serious technical obstacles. Ultimately, Berkeley's system also struggles to accommodate moral realism and objective value judgments within his idealist framework consistently and adequately. If all reality consists of ideas in minds, what grounds objective moral truths independent of individual or cultural opinions? He appealed to God's will as source of moral law, but this creates Euthyphro problems about whether morality is arbitrary divine command or independent of divine will constraining it. If moral facts are just God's ideas, they seem arbitrary preferences rather than objective truths binding on all rational agents necessarily. If moral facts exist independently of God, they constitute realm of abstract entities that immaterialism should exclude from legitimate ontology. Berkeley never developed systematic moral philosophy addressing these meta-ethical problems arising from his metaphysical commitments comprehensively at all. These fundamental problems demonstrate that Berkeley's immaterialism cannot be defended simply by refining arguments or clarifying interpretations alone. The difficulties reveal deep structural tensions between his empiricist epistemology and idealist metaphysics, requiring trade-offs among competing commitments. Every solution to one problem creates new difficulties elsewhere, suggesting that comprehensive consistency may be impossible within his framework. Yet these limitations do not negate his philosophical achievement in exposing assumptions and challenging orthodoxies productively throughout modern philosophy. Part 10. Conclusion and Enduring Significance. George Berkeley's philosophical system represents one of the most radical and thoroughly developed positions in Western philosophy's history. His immaterialism challenged fundamental assumptions about reality that most people never question or examine critically at all. By insisting that material substance does not exist and that physical objects are collections of ideas, Berkeley forced philosophers to articulate and defend commitments normally taken as obvious and self-evident truths. His arguments exposed vulnerabilities in mechanistic materialism and representational realism that continue provoking philosophical debate today persistently. Berkeley's enduring significance lies not primarily in successful defense of immaterialism, but in his profound analysis of perception and experience. Few contemporary philosophers accept his idealist metaphysics literally without significant modifications addressing persistent objections raised historically. Yet his insights about the primacy of phenomenal experience and the mind dependence of sensory qualities influence multiple philosophical traditions substantially. Phenomenalism, phenomenology, pragmatism, logical positivism, and various contemporary movements incorporate Berkeleyan themes, while rejecting his theological framework. Common misconceptions about Berkeley's philosophy persist even among educated readers encountering his works for the first time regularly. The most frequent error interprets Berkeley as denying that tables and mountains really exist, or claiming physical world is illusory. Berkeley insisted repeatedly that physical objects are perfectly real, possessing exactly the properties we perceive them having in experience. He denied that material substance underlies these properties, not that the properties themselves exist as genuine features of reality. The table is real as a collection of ideas, which is what it is experienced as being immediately in conscious perception. Dismissing this as claiming tables do not exist, misses Berkeley's subtle distinction between objects and material substance entirely. Another misconception treats Berkeley's philosophy as solipsistic, claiming that only one mind and its ideas exist in his system necessarily. Berkeley explicitly argued for other finite minds and God's existence as essential to his metaphysics throughout all major works. He recognized that solipsism is an absurd consequence that any adequate philosophy must avoid through compelling arguments for other minds. While his arguments for other minds may be weaker than his critique of matter, he did not embrace solipsism intentionally or accept it as acceptable consequence of immaterialism logically implied. A third misconception confuses Berkeley's idealism with Kantian transcendental idealism, despite significant differences between these philosophical positions fundamentally. Berkeley claimed objects are mind-dependent ideas existing only when actually perceived by some conscious mind at that moment. Kant argued that space and time are subjective forms, structuring experience, while objects possess empirical reality independently of particular perceptions. Kant's things in themselves exist beyond possible experience, which Berkeley would reject as incoherent and meaningless concept entirely. These differences mean that Kant's refutation of dogmatic idealism may not actually address Berkeley's sophisticated position as articulated in Principles and Dialogues carefully examined. Kant may have understood Berkeley primarily through later work, series, rather than earlier systematic presentations of immaterialism more clearly argued. Berkeley's methodological innovations shaped subsequent philosophical practice beyond his particular metaphysical conclusions, reached through reasoning carefully. His phenomenological attention to actual conscious experience anticipated later phenomenology's descriptive methodology, focusing on appearances themselves rigorously. His semantic analysis, showing how words function without signifying impossible abstract ideas, prefigured ordinary language, philosophy's attention to linguistic usage. His philosophy of science, distinguishing mathematical description from metaphysical explanation, anticipated instrumentalism and structural realism in contemporary philosophy considerably. The master argument remains philosophically provocative, despite its apparent simplicity and generations of criticism attempting refutation successfully, conclusively. It forces reflection on the limits of conceivability and whether conceivability guides possibility judgments reliably in metaphysics always. If we cannot coherently conceive mind-independent existence, this might reveal conceptual limitations rather than metaphysical truths about reality itself. Yet the argument highlights genuine difficulty in specifying what mind-independent existence involves without employing mind-dependent conceptual resources necessarily. Berkeley's critique of abstract ideas advanced empiricism significantly by exposing tensions in Lockean abstraction theory, requiring better alternatives developed subsequently. Even those rejecting Berkeley's eliminative nominalism acknowledge that his arguments reveal genuine psychological and logical difficulties with traditional accounts. Modern cognitive science confirms that categorization and concept formation work differently than classical abstraction theories supposed in important respects. While concepts are not simply particular images, neither are they Lockean abstract ideas lacking determinate properties completely altogether. His emphasis on perception's active constructive role anticipated contemporary theories treating perception as inference and prediction rather than passive reception. Sensory experience involves organizing and interpreting sensory data through cognitive processes shaped by prior learning and expectations extensively. The brain constructs perceptual experience from incomplete information using internal models predicting environmental causes of sensations received continuously. This active inference framework resonates with Berkeley's rejection of pure passive sensation, independent of mental organizing activity constitutively. Berkeley's theology attempted synthesizing Christian orthodoxy with empiricist philosophy in ways that ultimately proved unsuccessful but philosophically instructive nonetheless. His use of God to solve philosophical problems like continuity and causation reveals difficulties any theistic philosophy faces integrating divine action with empirical investigation rigorously. The tension between empiricism's restriction to experience and theology's appeal to transcendent divine reality creates unavoidable strains in Berkeley's system fundamentally. Secular versions of phenomenalism attempted eliminating theological elements while preserving Berkeley's core insights about phenomenal experience and mind dependence. Yet these secular phenomenalisms encountered technical obstacles that eventually led to widespread abandonment of the research program, generally by 1960s. The failure of phenomenalist reduction does not vindicate naive scientific realism about mind-independent material, substance, automatically or conclusively. Rather, it shows that the relationship between phenomenal experience and physical reality involves more complexity than either Berkeley or his critics initially recognized fully. Contemporary philosophy of perception navigates between naive realism and sense-data idealism, using sophisticated tools unavailable to 18th-century philosophers originally. Quantum mechanics introduced unexpected connections to Berkeleyan themes about observation and reality that remain philosophically controversial and actively debated currently. Whether quantum mechanics vindicates idealism or merely shows limitations of classical realism about unobserved systems remains unsettled fundamentally. The measurement problem and interpretations invoking consciousness echo Berkeley's emphasis on perception's constitutive role in determining what exists. Yet most physicists favor realist interpretations, avoiding both consciousness and idealism while accommodating quantum phenomena through alternative ontologies developed. Berkeley's influence on American pragmatism demonstrates how philosophical ideas transform through engagement across different intellectual contexts and traditions productively. William James absorbed Berkeley's empiricism about immediate experience while rejecting his substance. Dualism and theological commitments entirely substantially. Pragmatists emphasized practical consequences and functional utility rather than metaphysical speculation about underlying reality independent of experience altogether. This pragmatic turn preserved Berkeley's phenomenological focus while avoiding his problematic idealist metaphysics about immaterial substance, replacing material substance. Contemporary debates about consciousness, perception and reality continue grappling with problems Berkeley identified even when rejecting his solutions as inadequate ultimately. The explanatory gap between physical processes and phenomenal experience recreates Berkeley's puzzle about mind-matter interaction in naturalistic framework. The hard problem of consciousness asks why physical brain states produce subjective qualities rather than occurring without conscious awareness whatsoever. Various responses, including eliminativism, Functionalism, property dualism, and panpsychism each face objections reminiscent of classical problems Berkeley confronted originally. Berkeley's achievement consists less in establishing immaterialism than in demonstrating the difficulty of defending any metaphysical position conclusively and permanently. His arguments reveal that common-sense realism about material objects rests on assumptions requiring philosophical defense rather than self-evident certainty. The relationship between mind and world, thought and reality, consciousness and matter remains fundamentally mysterious despite scientific progress. Berkeley showed that empiricism consistently applied undermines materialism without necessarily establishing idealism as the only alternative available to philosophers. His systematic philosophy exhibits remarkable internal coherence despite the problems discussed previously that prevent complete success ultimately and definitively. The way his critique of abstraction supports his demolition of material substance, which grounds his immaterialism, which motivates his theology, demonstrates philosophical architectonic skill impressively. Each element supports others while being supported by them in a complex web of mutually reinforcing arguments and doctrines systematically integrated. This holistic character makes Berkeley's system philosophically interesting even when individual arguments prove unconvincing, examined in isolation separately. Berkeley exemplifies how philosophical insight often comes from taking common beliefs seriously enough to question them radically and systematically. His willingness to follow arguments wherever they led, even to counterintuitive conclusions challenging orthodoxy, represents philosophical courage worthy of admiration. Whether his conclusions prove ultimately correct matters less than the intellectual rigor and creativity he brought to philosophical problems. He expanded the space of philosophical possibilities by developing a comprehensive worldview radically different from prevailing assumptions. His works remain valuable for teaching philosophy because they force students to examine assumptions and articulate positions clearly when challenged rigorously. Engaging Berkeley's arguments develops philosophical skills even when students ultimately reject immaterialism after careful consideration thoroughly. The process of understanding and evaluating his system cultivates critical thinking, logical analysis, and conceptual clarity essential for philosophical practice. Berkeley's accessibility, combined with his radical conclusions, makes him ideal for introducing philosophical methodology to beginning students effectively. The truth that Berkeley sought to reveal concerns perception's essential role in constituting the experience world we inhabit and investigate scientifically. Physical objects, as we know them, depend on consciousness and sensory experience in ways that naive realism fails to recognize adequately. Whether this dependence is metaphysical, as Berkeley claimed, or merely epistemological, as others argue, remains philosophically contested continuously. But the question itself proves unavoidable for any serious philosophy attempting to understand knowledge, reality, and their relationship comprehensively. Berkeley's philosophy demonstrates that apparently absurd positions may rest on powerful arguments exposing weaknesses in conventional alternatives critically examined. His immaterialism forces us to recognize how much we assume without justification about reality's nature and structure fundamentally throughout. Even rejecting his conclusions, we emerge with better understanding of why we believe what we do about minds, matter, and perception. This self-understanding represents genuine philosophical progress, regardless of whether Berkeley's positive doctrine proves defensible ultimately or not. 3 centuries after his major works appeared, Berkeley remains philosophically relevant because he addressed perennial problems about consciousness and reality. New scientific discoveries and philosophical methods emerge, but the fundamental puzzles he confronted persist in transformed versions. How does consciousness relate to physical world? How do we know external reality? What is the nature of perception and experience? These questions admit no easy answers, and Berkeley's contributions continue illuminating the conceptual landscape we navigate in addressing them. His legacy lives on not in widespread acceptance of immaterialism, but in sharpened awareness of perception's philosophical significance. Berkeley taught philosophy that the experienced world cannot be taken for granted as transparent window onto mind-independent reality existing behind appearances. Consciousness and subjectivity are not epiphenomena to be explained away, but central features requiring philosophical attention and theoretical accommodation. This lesson resonates across contemporary philosophy of mind, phenomenology, cognitive science, and philosophy of perception significantly and persistently. George Berkeley revealed philosophical truths not about what exists, but about the difficulty of knowing what exists beyond conscious experience. His immaterialism may be false, but the questions he raised remain unanswered, challenging each generation of philosophers anew persistently.